This episode, Kissinger, Order, Power, and Chaos from the Sovereign Drift series, is brought to you by This Card Studio.
I have to be honest with you. I'm actually a little intimidated. This stack of papers is a mountain.
You can't just read his Wikipedia page and get it.
We are talking, of course, about Henry Kissinger. He died recently, hitting the century mark, 100 years old. And usually, when a historical figure passes, especially one that old, the dust settles pretty quickly. You know, you get a consensus. The headlines say he was a hero or he was a villain, and everyone moves on.
Right. The verdict usually comes in within 48 hours. The narrative gets set in stone.
But with Kissinger, there is no verdict. There is just a war. Depending on which document I pull from this pile, he is either the architectural genius who prevented World War III and saved Western civilization, or he is a literal war criminal who should have ended his days in a cell at The Hague.
And that tension is exactly where we need to live for the next hour. Because you cannot understand the world we live in today, 2026, without understanding the architecture Henry Kissinger built. He didn't just live through history. He engineered it.
That's what struck me the most during the prep. He's like the Forrest Gump of the geopolitical underworld. He is everywhere.
It is uncanny when you start looking at the timeline. Truly.
I'm serious. You look at a photo from the Nixon administration in the late 60s, he's there. You look at a photo of Putin in the early 2000s, Kissinger is there, shaking his hand. You look at the board of directors for cutting-edge AI companies in 2023. There he is again, warning about the dangers of algorithms. He advised nearly every U.S. president from Kennedy to Biden.
But unlike Forrest Gump, he wasn't just drifting on the wind. He was the wind. Or at least he was trying to be.
So here is our mission for this deep dive. We aren't just going to recite dates. I want to understand the software running in this guy's head. How does a Jewish refugee fleeing the Nazis end up giving the green light to a genocide in Bangladesh? What is realism, really? And yes, I want to know what's going on with those deep state files at the bottom of the stack.
We're going to deconstruct the Kissinger doctrine. We have to peel back the layers of the public persona and look at the mechanic underneath.
Buckle up. This is going to be a turbulent ride. Let's start at the very beginning. Because before he was the Henry we know, he was Heinz.
That's right. Heinz Alfred Kissinger, born 1923 in Fürth, Germany. And I cannot stress this enough. You cannot understand the man in the White House without understanding the child in Germany.
Set the scene for us. 1923. This is the Weimar Republic.
It's the Weimar years, yeah, heading right into the rise of Hitler. Kissinger grew up in a Jewish Orthodox family. His father was a school teacher. It was a very structured, intellectual household. But looking at the timeline, he's 9 years old when Hitler is elected chancellor.
9 years old. That's fourth grade.
Imagine that. You're 9. You have a world that makes sense. You have rules. You have your friends. You have your school. And then almost overnight, the order of your life is just gone. The sources describe this vivid memory he had of learning about Hitler's election. It wasn't just political news. It was a shift in the atmosphere.
One detail in the biography that really got to me was the soccer stadium. He was a huge fan, right?
Massive fan. He played for the youth team of SPV Fürth. He loved the game. But suddenly, the laws change. Jews are barred from the stadium. His world shrinks.
But he tried to go anyway. I read that too.
He did. There are stories in the files about him sneaking into stadiums to watch matches and getting beaten up by the Hitler Youth or security guards. He would get beaten up, come home, and not tell his parents because he didn't want to worry them.
That's a lot for a kid to process. The people who are supposed to protect you, the police, the neighbors, they're now the threat. The very fabric of society turns against you.
Exactly. And his father was fired from his teaching job. The structure of their life just it disintegrated. They managed to flee to New York in 1938, but the trauma of what they left behind is foundational. You have to remember, they got out, but most didn't. 13 of his close relatives who stayed behind were killed in the Holocaust.
Now, later in life, Kissinger famously downplayed this. He would say things like, I don't dwell on the past, or that didn't shape my policy.
He did say that. He wanted to be seen as an American statesman, not a Jewish victim. But psychologists and biographers arguing in our source material suggest that this trauma created a fundamental obsession in him. Not an obsession with justice, but an obsession with order.
Okay, I want to unpack that distinction. Because to me, order and justice usually go together.
Yeah.
Law and order, right?
In the American mind, yes. We see them as two sides of the same coin. But look at it from his perspective. The Germany of his youth, the late Weimar Republic, was chaotic. It was unstable. There were street fights, political assassinations, economic collapse. And then the Nazis came and they imposed a horrific kind of order. But the transition, the collapse of society, the chaos, That was what terrified him.
So the chaos was the ultimate enemy.
Exactly. If you read his academic work, which we will get to, his philosophy is basically injustice is bad, but chaos is worse. Chaos is the ultimate evil because in chaos, everyone dies. In a dictatorship, maybe only some people die.
That is an incredibly dark calculus. I mean, that's a chilling thought. So better a dictator who keeps the peace than a revolution that burns everything down.
Precisely. That is the seed of his entire career. He looked at the world and saw a thin crust of ice over a deep ocean of chaos. And his job, as he saw it, was to keep the ice from breaking no matter what the cost.
So he gets to New York, Washington Heights to be exact, changes his name to Henry, works in a shaving brush factory during the day, goes to school at night. It's the classic immigrant story. And then the draft, 1943.
This is the pivot point. This is where Heinz becomes Henry for real. He goes into the army, and because he speaks fluent German with the accent and everything, he gets moved out of the infantry and into the counterintelligence corps, the 970th CIC.
That sounds like spy stuff.
It is. He's tasked with rooting out Gestapo officers in the city of Hanover after it's captured. Imagine the psychological flip. A few years ago, he's getting beaten up by these people in brown shirts. Now he is the authority. He is the one hunting them. He holds the power of life and death.
Talk about a power trip for a 20-year-old.
But by all accounts, he was brilliant at it. He was effective. He earned a Bronze Star. And he learned how to administer a town, how to impose structure, how to root out subversion. It was his first taste of applying order.
So he comes back from the war, a decorated soldier, gets into Harvard on the GI Bill. And this is where Kissinger the scholar is born.
And this is where we really have to look at the software. His doctoral dissertation is legendary in academic circles. It's called A World Restored.
And it's about 19th century Europe. I mean, it sounds so arcane.
It does, but it's the blueprint for everything he does later. Specifically, it's about the peace established after the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon had shattered Europe, created absolute chaos for decades. Kissinger studied how the diplomats put it all back together at the Congress of Vienna. And he focuses on one guy in particular, a guy named Clemens von Metternich.
Metternich, that's a name that keeps popping up in the sources. He's like Kissinger's spirit animal.
He really is. Metternich was the Austrian statesman. He wasn't a Democrat, he wasn't a liberal, he was an aristocrat who wanted to preserve the monarchy. But he engineered a balance of power in Europe that, for the most part, prevented major wars for decades. Kissinger idolized that. He saw Metternich as the ultimate realist.
And here is the aha moment from his thesis that I want to drill into. Kissinger defines legitimacy in a very, very specific way.
This is the key. This is the Rosetta Stone to his entire worldview.
When I hear legitimate, I think fair. I think people voted for it. I think morally right.
Exactly. That's the American idealism speaking. That is not how Kissinger used the word. In Kissinger's thesis, legitimacy isn't about what is fair. It isn't about what is moral. It is simply an agreement between the great powers to accept the status quo.
Break that down for me. What does that mean in practice?
Okay, imagine a room with 3 big, powerful guys and 10 smaller, weaker guys. If the 3 big guys agree on the rules, I won't hit you if you don't hit me, and we'll decide what happens to everyone else, then the system is legitimate. Even if the big guys are stepping on the little guys, even if the little guys are miserable, as long as the great powers aren't fighting each other, the system works. Stability is achieved.
That is so cold. It's treating the world like a risk board. It completely removes the people from the equation.
It's realism, or realpolitik. The goal of statecraft, in his view, isn't peace in some utopian holding hands sense. It's equilibrium. It's stability. And to maintain that stability, sometimes you have to do terrible things to the little guys to keep the big guys happy.
So he takes this philosophy, this idea that great powers manage the world like a chessboard, and he brings it into the Nixon White House in 1969.
And that brings us to one of the most fascinating, toxic, and consequential relationships in political history, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger.
The odd couple. I mean, that's an understatement.
Truly. Kissinger starts as National Security Advisor. Eventually, he becomes the first person to be Secretary of State and National Security Advisor at the same time. He held both titles. That is an unprecedented concentration of power in one unelected official.
But the relationship with Nixon, I was reading these transcripts, these telecons, and it's just bizarre. It's like a bad marriage.
It's incredibly dysfunctional. It's a mix of mutual dependence and deep-seated resentment. In public, and to Nixon's face, Kissinger is fawning. I mean, really laying it on thick. He's telling Nixon he's a genius, the greatest leader in history, a true visionary.
But in private. to his aides, to journalists.
He's calling Nixon a madman. He called him a meatball mind. He looked down on Nixon intellectually, saw him as unstable and crude.
And Nixon gave it right back. He was just as two-faced.
Oh, absolutely. Nixon was deeply insecure. He was paranoid that Kissinger was getting more credit than him, that he was the star. He would refer to Kissinger as my Jew boy. He would rant to his other aides about Kissinger stealing the limelight and leaking to the press to make himself look good.
And that paranoia wasn't just talk. We have to talk about the wiretaps. This is where it gets really dark inside the White House itself.
Right. This is the era of the Pentagon Papers. Leaks are happening. The administration is paranoid about its secrets getting out. And Kissinger, the man obsessed with order, is furious about the leaks. He sees them as a form of chaos, so he actually gets involved in authorizing the wiretapping of his own top aides, his own staff.
He's tapping his own team's phones.
Yes, to stop the leaks. It creates this culture of intense secrecy and suspicion. They set up these back channels. Basically, Kissinger and Nixon are running foreign policy by themselves from the basement of the White House. They're often cutting out the State Department, the military brass, and certainly Congress.
Why? Why cut them out? What's the strategic advantage?
Because democracy is slow, bureaucracy is slow and leaky. Kissinger wanted to move pieces on the board fast with absolute secrecy. If you have to ask Congress for permission or brief the entire State Department, you lose the element of surprise. You lose the moment. So they just didn't ask.
Which allowed them to make some massive moves very quickly, but it also meant there was almost no oversight. And that double-edged sword is what defines his legacy.
Exactly. And we see the masterstroke side of this first. The stuff that gets him labeled a diplomatic genius. And the biggest piece on the board has to be China.
Without a doubt. Triangular diplomacy. This is the stuff they teach in textbooks.
So paint the picture. Late 60s. The Cold War is a rigid standoff, U.S. versus the Soviet Union. The assumption in Washington was that the communist world was one big happy family, a monolith. Red is red, right?
That was the whole domino theory. If Vietnam falls, they all fall in a line because they're all working together, directed from Moscow.
But Kissinger saw a crack. He was a student of history, and he looked at the intelligence and saw that China and the Soviet Union actually hated each other. They were rivals. They had different ideologies. They were even having small skirmishes on their borders. They were rivals for leadership of the communist world.
So he decides to exploit that rivalry, to split them apart.
Exactly. To play one against the other. Use China to leverage the Soviets, and use the Soviets to leverage China. If the U.S. suddenly cozies up to China, the Soviets get terrified of being isolated, of being surrounded by NATO in the West and a U.S.-backed China in the East.
But he couldn't just call up Mao Zedong. There were no diplomatic relations. They hadn't talked in over 2 decades.
No, it had to be done in total secrecy, so he had to go undercover. This is the famous stomachache story.
I love this detail. It's straight out of a spy novel.
He was on a televised diplomatic trip to Pakistan in 1971, and in the middle of it, he feigned a stomach illness. He announced, "Oh, I'm sick. I need to rest in a hill station for 48 hours. No press, please."
And while the entire World Press Corps is standing outside an empty guest house thinking he's recovering,
Kissinger is on a secret Pakistani plane flying over the Himalayas to Beijing, a completely clandestine mission.
to meet with Zhou Enlai, the Chinese premier.
And this meeting changed the world. It laid the groundwork for Nixon's historic visit in 1972. It completely shifted the balance of the Cold War. The Soviets were suddenly the odd man out. They had to come to the table. They were panicked.
Which led to détente.
Right? The easing of tensions. Because the Soviets were scared of this new U.S.-China alliance, they became much more willing to negotiate. They agreed to the strategic arms limitation talks. You have to remember, Kissinger wrote a whole book called Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy. He was terrified of nuclear war. He believed you have to manage the Soviets to avoid the apocalypse, and opening China was the lever he used to do it.
And then there's the Middle East, the Yom Kippur War in 1973. This is another example of the masterstroke.
It really is. Kissinger had just become Secretary of State, I think, 2 weeks before the war started. It was his trial by fire. Egypt and Syria launch a surprise attack on Israel on the holiest day of the Jewish year. It's a massive crisis. Israel is on the ropes initially.
And this is where we get the term shuttle diplomacy. He basically lived on a plane for a month.
He was literally living on an Air Force jet, flying back and forth between Cairo, Tel Aviv, and Damascus. And his strategy was fascinating. It goes back to his academic roots. He didn't try to solve the whole problem. He didn't try to create peace instantly. He went for step by step.
Disengagement. Small, manageable steps.
Yes, he knew emotions were too high for a full peace treaty. So he said, let's just get the armies to pull back a few kilometers here. Let's swap some prisoners there. He managed the massive airlift of U.S. supplies to Israel to ensure they survived, which angered the Arabs. But then he immediately pivoted and engaged Egypt. He showed both sides that only the U.S. could deliver.
And the result was the big picture outcome.
He effectively flipped Egypt. Under Anwar Sadat, Egypt moved from the Soviet sphere of influence to the American sphere. He sidelined the Russians in the Middle East for decades. He stabilized the situation and prevented a U.S.-Soviet confrontation.
It's impressive tactical work. Even his harshest critics, and there are many, admit that he was a master negotiator on this front.
It is. It stabilized the region for a time and cemented American dominance there. But, and this is a huge but, we have to look at the cost. Because while he was playing three-dimensional chess with the great powers, there were a lot of pawns getting sacrificed on the board.
And this brings us to the dark chapters, the stuff that makes people call him a war criminal. We have to talk about Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos.
This is the shadow that never left him. No matter how many cocktail parties he went to in New York later in life, no matter how many Davos panels he sat on, the ghosts of Indochina were always there.
Let's start with the ultimate paradox. In 1973, Henry Kissinger is awarded the Nobel Peace Prize.
For the Paris Peace Accords, which supposedly ended the Vietnam War.
He shares it with Le Duc Tho from North Vietnam.
And Le Duc Tho refuses it. He turns it down flat.
Why?
Because he said, quote, peace has not yet been established. And he was absolutely right. The war was still raging. 2 members of the Nobel Committee resigned in protest. It was a scandal. It remains one of the most controversial Nobels ever awarded.
The accusation here is about something called the decent interval.
The indecent interval, as some critics call it. And the theory, which is supported by the timeline and the declassified transcripts, is that Kissinger knew South Vietnam couldn't survive. He knew the war was lost. But the U.S. couldn't just leave and look like losers. It would hurt American credibility.
So what was the plan? If they knew they couldn't win?
The plan was to negotiate a withdrawal that allowed the U.S. to pull its troops out and then have a decent interval, maybe a year or two before South Vietnam actually collapsed. Get the POWs back, get the troops home, and then blame the fall of Saigon on the South Vietnamese themselves.
So they stayed in the war, and thousands more Americans and hundreds of thousands more Vietnamese died, just to buy time, just so the collapse wouldn't happen on their watch immediately.
That is the harsh realist calculation. American honor and global standing, the perception of power, were worth more than the lives lost in those final years. He didn't want the U.S. to look weak.
But it gets so much worse when you look at the neighbors. We have to talk about Cambodia. We have to talk about Operation Menu.
Operation Menu. The code name itself is chilling. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, snack. These were the names for the bombing runs.
This is the part of the timeline where the statesman image really cracks for me. We are in 1969. Nixon wants to send a message to the North Vietnamese who are using Cambodia, a neutral country, for supply lines along the Ho Chi Minh Trail.
Right. And Nixon gives an order. We have the notes on this call. He calls Kissinger and says, and this is a direct quote, anything that flies on anything that moves.
Pause on that. Anything that flies on anything that moves. That's not a military order. That is an order for annihilation. It implies zero discrimination. No targets, just destruction.
It is total war. And Kissinger didn't push back. He didn't say, Mr. President, that's a war crime. We can't do that. He relayed the order. He managed the logistics. He personally approved the bombing sorties. They kept a separate, secret set of books to hide it from Congress and the American public. They dropped 500,000 tons of bombs on a neutral country.
500,000 tons. Let's put that in perspective.
For context, the Allies dropped about 160,000 tons of bombs on the entirety of Japan during World War II, not including the atomic bombs. The U.S. dropped 3 times that amount on rural Cambodia.
And the consequences, the blowback.
This is the ultimate tragedy, blowback. Kissinger thought he was solving a short-term tactical problem cutting supply lines, but he created a long-term strategic nightmare. The bombing completely destabilized the Cambodian government of Prince Sihanouk. It drove the rural population insane with fear and rage.
If you're a rice farmer and for 4 years the sky is falling and your family is being killed by an invisible enemy,
you look for protection. And the only people offering protection, the only people fighting back against the imperialist bombers were this small, fringe group of Maoist communists hiding in the jungle.
the Khmer Rouge.
Exactly. Before the bombing, the Khmer Rouge was nothing. They were a nuisance. Pol Pot was a nobody. But Kissinger's bombing campaign became their single greatest recruitment tool. The peasantry flocked to Pol Pot for revenge.
So you can draw a straight line from Kissinger's desk in the White House to the killing fields.
Many historians in the stack do exactly that. They argue that without Kissinger's menu, Pol Pot never seizes power. And 2 million people don't die in the Cambodian genocide that followed.
And even today, in Laos and Cambodia, people are still dying from unexploded ordnance UXOs that were dropped during that secret campaign. The war isn't over for them. It's still in their fields.
It's a heavy, heavy legacy. But it wasn't just Southeast Asia. I mean, you open another folder in the stack, and the documents on Latin America are just as damning.
This is where we see the real politic in its rawest form. Morality didn't just take a back seat. It was kicked out of the car and left on the side of the road. Let's talk about Chile, 1973.
Salvador Allende. It's important to remember he was a socialist, but he was democratically elected. The Chilean people voted for him.
But Kissinger and Nixon viewed him as a threat, another domino that could lead to a communist South America.
Kissinger famously said regarding Chile, and I'm quoting from a declassified memo here, "I don't see why we need to stand by and watch a country go communist because of the irresponsibility of its own people."
The irresponsibility of its own people. Wow. I mean, just the arrogance in that statement. So democracy is only good if they vote the way we want.
In his view, yes. If the global order is threatened, the democratic will of a small country is secondary. We have the notes where Nixon orders the CIA with Kissinger as the conduit to make the economy scream in Chile.
To destabilize the country so a coup could happen. To create chaos so their guy could impose order.
And it did. September 11, 1973. General Augusto Pinochet leads a military coup. Allende is killed, and Pinochet takes power. A brutal military dictatorship follows. Torture centers, people being thrown out of helicopters into the ocean, thousands of disappeared dissidents.
And later in 1976, Kissinger meets with Pinochet. We have the transcript of that meeting. What does he say to this dictator?
He tells him, quote, "You did a great service to the West in overthrowing Allende. We want to help, not undermine you." He is face to face with a man running torture camps, and he is congratulating him, praising him.
Because Pinochet provided order. He was an anti-communist.
Exactly. He was anti-communist. He was pro-business. He was our dictator.
And it goes even further. There was something called Operation Condor.
This was a truly horrifying program. It was a cross-border assassination program run by these South American dictatorships, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, others. They were hunting down political dissidents who had fled to other countries and killing them. On the streets of Rome, in Buenos Aires, even in Washington, D.C. The sources indicate Kissinger was well aware of it. There was a moment where the State Department drafted a diplomatic warning, a demarche to these countries to stop the assassinations. Kissinger personally blocked it.
He blocked the warning, so he knew about the assassinations and chose not to try and stop them.
He essentially gave them a quiet pass to continue.
It's a pattern. I mean, you look at the files, and we see the same thing in East Timor.
1975. President Ford and Kissinger visit Indonesia. They meet with the dictator Suharto. Suharto tells them he wants to invade East Timor to stop a leftist government from taking power there, and Kissinger basically gives him the green light. The transcript shows him telling Suharto to do it quickly and not to use American weapons in a way that would be obvious. The next day, Indonesia invades. Over 100,000 people die.
And Bangladesh in 1971. The blood telegram.
This is one of the most shameful moments in U.S. diplomatic history. The U.S. diplomats on the ground in Dhaka, led by a man named Archer Blood, were screaming that the Pakistani army was committing genocide in what would become Bangladesh. Mass rape, mass murder, targeting intellectuals and Hindus. They sent a famous telegram dissenting against U.S. policy, calling it moral bankruptcy.
But Kissinger ignored it. He sided with the Pakistani dictatorship.
Why? Why would he do that? Because Pakistan was the secret conduit to China. He needed the Pakistani dictator Yahya Khan to pass messages to Beijing for the secret opening. So he ignored a genocide to protect his diplomatic back channel.
That is the cold, hard math of his realism. The big game with China was worth the lives lost in the little game in Bangladesh.
To him, yes. It was a trade he was willing to make.
Okay, so we have the diplomat, the bomber, the realist. But there's another layer to this deep dive, one that goes into the territory of, let's call it alternative history or conspiracy research.
The deep state angle, the stuff from the bottom of the pile.
Right. Now, we have to preface this very carefully. These are allegations found in specific alternative research sources, particularly from writers like Fritz Springmeier, and in the files on something called the Committee of 300. This isn't the mainstream narrative you'll find in the New York Times.
No, this is the shadow history. But since we're looking at the entire stack of information surrounding Kissinger, we can't ignore that for a huge segment of people, Kissinger isn't just a statesman, he's an operative.
An operative for who?
For the global elite, the Illuminati, whatever name you want to give the structure that supposedly exists above national governments.
The sources here discuss bloodlines. Specifically, the idea that Kissinger wasn't just a smart immigrant who made it big through his own genius, but that he was selected and promoted by these powerful families.
Springmeyer's research, for example, categorizes Kissinger as a servant of the top 13 Illuminati families. The narrative here is that Kissinger's rise was facilitated because he aligned himself with these elite bloodlines early on in his career.
Well, he did start his career as a key advisor to Nelson Rockefeller.
Exactly. And to the conspiracy researchers, that is the smoking gun. The Rockefellers are viewed as one of these central dynastic families running the world. The claim is that Kissinger acted as the intellectual muscle, the chief administrator for the global elite's agenda. He was the one who could translate their broad goals into actionable foreign policy.
And there's mention of the Committee of 300. What's that about?
This is described in the alternative stack as a supranational group. A council of European aristocracy, American banking families, intelligence chiefs that actually steers global events. The idea is that governments are just theater. Presidents come and go, but the committee remains. Kissinger is identified in these sources as a key member, perhaps even the head of the geopolitical section for a long time.
So in this view, he's the CEO of the New World Order, but not the owner.
That's a great way to put it. He's the manager. He's the one who makes the trains run on time for the hidden oligarchy. He implements the plan.
The files also allege links to some very shadowy groups, like P2 Masonry.
Now, P2 propaganda was a real thing. This isn't just theory. It was a Masonic lodge in Italy that was exposed in the 1980s. It was a state within a state. It involved the heads of Italian intelligence, generals, journalists, and it had deep links to the Vatican Bank and the mafia.
It sounds like a bad airport thriller novel, but P2 was real history.
It was, and the alternative sources allege Kissinger had involvement there, linking him to the shadowy underworld of intelligence and occult power. It connects him to the strategy of tension, the idea of using chaos and terrorism to control populations and justify more authoritarian measures.
And British intelligence.
This is a recurring theme in a lot of this literature, that Kissinger was actually a British asset at his core, that he was aligned with the Royal Institute of International Affairs, which is the British sister organization to the Council on Foreign Relations here in the U.S.
The CFR Kissinger was a giant in the Council on Foreign Relations.
It was. The theory goes that his ultimate loyalty was to this Atlanticist British-American elite structure, what some call the Anglo-American Empire, not strictly to the American people or the Constitution.
There's even a mention here of a book called Dope, Inc. and the Global Drug Trade.
Right. And this is a very heavy accusation. The premise of Dope, Inc. is that the global drug trade, heroin, opium, cocaine, isn't just a bunch of criminals running wild. It's too organized, too well-financed for that. The claim is that it's actually managed, that intelligence agencies and international banking cartels use drug money to finance off-the-books operations, coups, assassinations.
And they say Kissinger was involved in managing this.
The theory connects his work in Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, an opium-producing region, and the Vietnam War to the flow of narcotics. It alleges that he helped facilitate the flow of these assets as a tool of geopolitical control and to fund the Cold War covert operations we just talked about.
Which, if you follow that thread, ties back to the history of the Opium Wars and some of those same elite families we mentioned earlier.
Exactly. It paints a picture of Kissinger not as a public servant, but as a manager for a hidden commercial and political empire. Now, whether you believe that or not, it speaks to how much power he projected. People looked at him and saw someone who was untouchable, someone who operated above the law.
And honestly, looking at his actual documented life, he did operate above the law.
Well,
he never faced prosecution for Cambodia or Chile. He just moved on.
He moved on to found Kissinger Associates.
His post office career, 1982, he basically invents the modern geopolitical consulting firm.
He monetized his Rolodex? It was genius, in a way. If you were CEO of a bank or a tech company and you wanted to know if you should invest in Russia or if you needed a meeting with the Chinese premier, you didn't call the State Department. You called Henry, and you paid him millions for the access and the analysis.
He sold strategic insight. He sold access. He sold his aura of power.
And he kept doing it right up until the end. advising Reagan, Bush, Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. He never really left the room where it happens.
Interestingly, in his final years, he pivoted to a new threat. He became very concerned about artificial intelligence.
Yes. He co-wrote a book about it. He was giving speeches, writing op-eds. He was warning that AI arms control was just as necessary as nuclear arms control. He compared it to the dawn of the nuclear age. He thought AI could destabilize the global order just as much as a nuke could.
Always back to order.
Always. He feared that AI would make decisions too fast for humans to control, leading to unintentional escalation and chaos. Same fear, new technology.
He died in November 2023 at home in Connecticut.
Yeah.
And the reaction. It was a perfect mirror of his life.
It was completely polarized. It was the perfect reflection of his life. Western leaders, the great powers, praised the statesman. They talk about the China opening and detente. They called him a giant. But in the global South, in South America, in Southeast Asia, in Bangladesh, they remembered the butcher, the man who had greenlit their suffering.
His final strategic proposition was about China again. He was pushing an idea he called co-evolution.
He believed the U.S. and China had to find a way to coexist, to compete and cooperate at the same time. He said if we didn't, we went into a full-blown Cold War II, we risked destroying the world. It was the same song he sang in the 70s. Equilibrium, balance of power.
So as we wrap this up, as we look at this whole messy, contradictory stack of information, we are left with the question we started with. How do we judge Henry Kissinger?
I don't think you can have one verdict. I think we have to look at his core thesis, his central belief. He believed that the world is a dangerous, chaotic place, and he believed that order is fragile and precious, and he believed that order must be maintained by the strong, and that sometimes maintaining that order requires a terrible, terrible moral cost.
He was willing to pay that cost, or rather, he was willing to let others pay that cost, Cambodians, Chileans, the Timorese, so that the great powers could stay stable and avoid a nuclear war.
Precisely. He consistently traded justice for order. He believed that without order, there can be no justice anyway. But in pursuing that order, he often crushed justice completely.
So here's the provocative thought for you listening right now. We are living in 2026. The world feels, well, it feels chaotic. The old structures are shaking.
You've got war in Europe, you've got major tension in Asia, you have technological disruption happening at a speed we can't comprehend. The order is fraying at the edges.
In a world that feels like it's descending into chaos, would you take the trade? If you could have a Metternich, someone who could guarantee peace and stability for you and your family, but the cost was that they had to do terrible things in the shadows to maintain it, would you take that deal?
Does the world miss the cold, hard management of a Kissinger? Or are we finally free of a curse that treated human lives like pawns on a chessboard?
And remember, the institutions Kissinger helped build and navigate, the World Economic Forum, the Bilderberg meetings, that deep state infrastructure that conspiracy researchers talk about, they didn't die with him. The software is still running.
The players change, but the game remains.
That's it for this deep dive. Thanks for listening.
Stay curious.